What You Now show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
I think that basically what both sides want is clearly a situation in which they recognize that they are rivals and competitors and perceive each other as threats, but at the same time want to carve out, want to manage conflict so that it doesn't spin out of control, and at the same time carve out areas where they may be able to work together. Um, the obvious issues, climate change, for example, potentially security in the Middle East, um, those kind of issues. I think the problem's going to be that on the one hand, the United States is going to emphasize the issues that the Chinese don't want to discuss, particularly human rights in Xinjiang, uh, in democracy in Hong Kong, the status of Taiwan. And I think there's also a reason why the Americans will insist on that. And that is that after 4 years of Donald Trump, the United States needs to regain the moral high ground. And the way to do that, of course, is by emphasis on human rights. On the other hand, the problem is that the Chinese take the attitude of wanting to suppress any public criticism, or even private criticism for that matter, of their policies, and sort of position themselves as the stern father. You have to correct your ways. You have made a mistake. And that's clearly not going to work. And it goes back to a degree of a Chinese sense of entitlement that goes back to their perception of their own history of having been violated, been humiliated by Western powers in the 19th century and early 20th century. But I think for this to work, they're going to have to learn to live with criticism. I think you're obviously going to see major competition on technology. And I think you're going to see far greater US government support for Western companies, and particularly US companies, to catch up, because they've lost some ground, partly because of the Trump administration's policies. Now, it's perfectly possible that the Americans catch up. And I think it's crucial because it's not just simply a question of technology. Obviously, whoever has the technological upper hand is going to have greater influence. But equally importantly, what the Chinese offer is not simply the technology. What they offer is an Orwellian surveillance state. So you're really talking about, when you're talking about technology, you're talking about multiple things: where the economy is going, what's going to drive the economy, the next sort of economic revolution. But you're also talking about a way of life, and therefore maintaining at least a technological equilibrium, if not a technological advantage, is going to be crucial. Of course you can compete. I mean, it's a question of policy and a question of dedicating resources. So if you're going to put the money into the research and development, that the vaccines are an example. You've had, granted the Chinese did that too, the Russians did that too, but as a matter of principles, companies, irrespective of where they come from, have been able to develop vaccines in a phenomenally rapid period of time because they had the resources to do so. Now, part of that was because government funded research, for example, at the National Institute of Health, in the United States had already done 2 decades of work that created the ground for development of a lot of these vaccines. So there's no reason why you can't repeat that. It's fundamentally a question of political will and dedicating the resources. You have the infrastructure. Well, I mean, in a sense, you level the playing field. Now, we're going to see whether the investment agreement between Europe and China gets ratified. I think in the current environment, actually, you may see that it won't be ratified, particularly after the Chinese have now sanctioned the members of the European Parliament. The Parliament is probably going to be less inclined. Now, to be fair to the Chinese, there's no reason why Americans or Europeans can't sanction or can sanction and Chinese can't. The question is whether sanctions really work and whether or not a tit for tat is going to get you to where you get. But fact of the matter is that's what we have. And as a result, I think that the European, the European-China investment agreement probably is going to be a more difficult proposition. Now, the other question is, and we don't really know that, what the Americans do with trade. The Biden administration still has to enunciate a trade policy. It hasn't lifted any of the trade sanctions against and tariffs against China, but it also hasn't said whether or not it will try and re-enter the TTP, the Asian trade or Pacific trade agreement, from which one of the first, if not the first action that Trump did when he came to office in 2017 was withdraw from that treaty. And that was a blow. That clearly gave China an upper hand. You also saw the development of a regional trade agreement in which members of the TTP were also members of the Chinese-led trade agreement. But I think it would be a psychological as well as an economic boost if the Americans were to return to that trade agreement. Well, I think there's several aspects to this. First of all, the Chinese spend far less than the Americans do on defense. I mean, the Chinese spend roughly $250 billion a year. The Americans spend $750 billion a year. Now, that's a lot on paper, and we don't know how much of that is waste, and how much of that could be used in a different way more efficiently. But nonetheless, the Americans clearly have a military upper hand. That's not to say that the Chinese are a weak military force, but they have a ways to go. The United States has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. China has 1, maybe 2. So it's got a ways to go. Having said that, there are military flashpoints. Taiwan is one of those. And you do have a very aggressive nationalist government and sentiment in China. And so, the potential for China wanting to put an end to issues with Taiwan, much in the same way it has done with Hong Kong. And the message from Hong Kong is it gets away with it. Makes Taiwan, of course, a military flashpoint. You've just had today the North Koreans fire 2 ballistic missiles. What was clearly designed to test the waters, not just in terms of their own missiles, but in how the United States will respond with a new administration. And China is a player in that. You do have potential flashpoints, but I think that, and you have, of course, the South China Sea, where again, the Chinese are being very aggressive, and literal states, like the Indonesians, like the Philippines, like the Vietnamese, like the Malaysians, are not particularly happy. Not that they um, necessarily can do something militarily, but um, if they play their cards right, you are going to see a greater US engagement. And you will see, as you've seen both with European navies as well as US navies, wanting to uh, demonstrate freedom of navigation by going through what are international but nonetheless disputed waters. Look, I think there are, climate change is one area where there's a common interest, without question. Public health, if the Chinese get off their high horse, is another area of potential cooperation. And not only potential cooperation, it's where cooperation is necessary. And it's to the benefit of both the United States and China and to the benefit of the world at large. I think that in some ways, on public health, the rhetoric of the Trump administration is history. You're not going to see the Biden administration talking about the China flu, the Kufeng flu, or whatever it is, the Wuhan flu. But I think you will see demanding transparency of what actually happened in China and how China handled, the period from late 2019 to the spring of 2020. The Chinese have not been all that transparent about that, and probably for good reason. But I think you're going to maintain. I mean, all of this is about conflict management rather than conflict resolution. So if you can manage your conflicts and at the same time recognize that there are areas that are mutually beneficial to cooperate on, then at least we have a manageable situation that's beneficial. Well, I think, look, that's true. Let's face it, China's a major market. There's no question about it. It's only a question of time before India's a major market. So China's not ultimately the only game in town. It's the first game in town. I think also that given Chinese policies, dealing with China is going to be could increasingly become problematic. China has reputational problems, certainly in the West. One of the first things that the Biden administration said on foreign policy was that basically said foreign policy is domestic policy. It has to also respond to the American public. And you've seen that already with companies who had supply chains in Xinjiang, whether they knew that they had them or not, but came into the firing line because they had them. So, I think what you're going to see is that, and you had, of course, and that was just very short-sighted, the willingness to hand over technology and knowledge just for the right to be able to do business in China. And the question is, in the longer term, whether that cost-benefit analysis was really one that favored the companies that did so. Look at a company like Google. They're doing fine without China. Or Facebook, for that matter. I'm not saying that one should step out of the Chinese market. What I am saying is that, put it in perspective. These companies existed and did very well before China, and they'll do well after China. And sure, if there's opportunity there at a fair price and a fair risk, there's no reason to take advantage of that opportunity. The world doesn't collapse if you're not doing business in China or you're doing less business in China. And sure, the Chinese have had a straight arrow for several decades, but that's not going to be eternal either. Well, that's the black swan question, basically. So with other words, there's no reason to assume at this point that anything is going to change or, in my mind, improve in China. But there are the black swans. China, there's their domestic issues, which are very opaque, but nonetheless they are there. China has made itself a feared and maybe respected country to some degree, but certainly not a loved country. And if there's one thing to have been learned from the West's experience, that's the importance of soft power. And China's soft power is really reduced to money and economic opportunity. And of course, you have major countries in Asia, first and foremost India. But also, I mean, you look at countries like Pakistan, like Indonesia, Bangladesh, that are going to be powers. And if these countries in trade agreements or whatever pool resources, you've got, China's got significant competition. That's, and then on top of that, I don't think that the Russians are simply going to hand Central Asia over to China. So, yeah, China's done very well. There's no reason not to assume that it's not going to do well for the foreseeable future, but it's also going to increasingly face challenges. Look, I think he's going to have to take some principled decisions. I think that the meeting in Alaska could have been handled in a very different way. I think there are things that he could do that would help to melt some of the ice, and he should do. But I also think he's got to take a hard line. I don't, I think that what is happening in genocide is not only, has to be unacceptable, not only in words, but in fact. If you allow these things to happen, you're on a very slippery slope. So I think it's going to be it has to be a combination of smart moves that allow you to manage conflict, but also being hard on core issues of principle.